So, in 2009, Stieg Larsson's beloved Millennium Trilogy was adapted for its native Swedish audience in its entirety in a single year, with a limited international release planned for 2010, by which point Sony Pictures, having secured the rights for its English adaptation, were already hard at work in pre-production, with David Fincher attached to direct, fresh off The Social Network, a film for which he'd be nominated for Best Director mere months later. The Social Network's score, however, composed and produced by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross of Nine Inch Nails fame, won their nomination, since becoming widely viewed as a milestone in Hollywood scoring by audiences, critics, and indeed other composers alike. During the early 2000s, a handful of mainstream scores had broken away from the more conventional practice of motivic orchestral scoring. Gustavo Santaolalla's consecutive Oscar wins for Brokeback Mountain and his Ron Rocco-led work for Babel being standout examples and stylistic precursors to his later work on the Last of Us game series. But The Social Network, Trent Reznor's first official foray into scoring, having previously provided supplemental work for David Fincher and David Lynch, symbolized a bold stylistic shift in what kinds of music could be considered Oscar-worthy. Principal photography commenced in 2010 for Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, what was for many a somewhat unnecessary adaptation so soon after its predecessor, and what's generally considered a breakneck turnaround for a production of this scale. It hit cinemas by Christmas 2011. The Social Network's backbone of ambient drones, almost serving as a kind of contorted analogy for the whirring fans of a server farm, juxtaposed with its very gentle piano lines, outlined the idea of a dark, sociopathic backdrop or underbelly of Facebook's development, which in 2010 at least was still seen as a technological marvel and force for good in society. In The Social Network, technological innovation is almost its own character of sorts, where fast-paced, arpeggiated synth lines map themselves to the keystrokes of Zuckerberg's keyboard. Blips and bleeps of synthesized sounds, while not an entirely original tool to denote the digital, borrowing from that sound design convention, are effective in this context at least for its necessary technological evocations in the score. The dance music inspired synthesized textures then overlaid can denote the more hedonistic plot points of the film, like students partying and having more money than they know what to do with. But there's an understood association between an opaquely digitally derived score and a narrative which is closely interlinked with technology.
Interlinked.
But in lieu of Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo follows Lisbeth Salander, a talented hacker and general social outcast in early 2000s Stockholm. She is contracted to provide an investigative report on disgraced journalist Mikael Blomkvist. Then, when Mikael is hired off the back of this report to investigate the decades-old murder of Harriet Vanger, a member of the industrialist Vanger dynasty, he then teams up with Lisbeth for her superior skill set. But for Lisbeth, more importantly, she agrees to help due to her deeply ingrained psychological drive to avenge abused women. It's Lisbeth's status as hacker and utilizer of technology more generally that acts as an aesthetic through-line between the two films, making the score's more obvious digital origin equally apt for The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, at least at that surface level. But this compositional style is also very atmospheric, cold and apathetic, yet often quite intimate, so was redeployed this time to describe the freezing Swedish landscapes, enigmatic murder mystery, and some visceral dramatic set pieces. It's little wonder then that Fincher's golden duo were invited back following their win for The Social Network. And in the unfortunate, and in my humble opinion, ludicrous absence of the planned sequels, it's satisfying at least that Reznor and Ross got to compose a spiritual successor of sorts to both of these films in 2014's Gone Girl. Reznor and Ross composed, and often still do, through a kind of abstracted or impressionistic method. Having read the script, but without any access to any of the footage at that stage in the production, they composed a suite of aesthetically targeted pieces, having an idea of tone and atmosphere that they, along with Fincher, wanted to attain, but without composing directly to picture. We started off thinking, let's just stay very abstract and very impressionistic, and when we didn't even have the script, I had read the book and spoke with David about the kinds of soundscapes, emotions, and whatnot, then we just blindly composed for 6 weeks. These looser, tonal soundscapes of sorts could then be molded around the image in the edit, a kind of audio cherry picking, leading to multiple scenes containing music from the same cue. In this context, it could be more prudent to think of them as songs or tracks rather than cues being needle dropped at the director and editor's whim, with perhaps only a minority of the individualized sections of the soundscapes being designated rigidly to specific scenes and moments, the others then flitting in and out for their atmospheric illusions only. This forensic control of music placement is then very befitting of Fincher's now legendary, meticulous production ethos, and allows for a continuation of the music's thematic content in narratively linked scenes in a really contemporary way, rather than the more traditional approach of writing additional cues to rework that motivic material. Throughout Hollywood scoring right up to the 21st century, a traditional symphony orchestra was, and still is to some degree, embedded in the film music canon with some sense of defaultness thanks to the legacy of Golden Age scoring and its renaissance. While there have always been instrumentational embellishments for specific use cases, usually around ethnomusicological lines, the four families of strings, brass, winds, and percussion have been largely universal. But access to the orchestra's myriad colours may be difficult to harness for composers without formal training in classical or orchestral composition. And even then, what's done with an orchestra can be limiting in a sense, as there is such a large catalogue of film music that's come before it that each new score is referencing in some way, if not directly quoting, to be included in the legacy of that practice, or at least to utilise the codes it's established. While most orchestral scores are now produced, at least initially, via samples in the digital audio workstation, I'm defining electronic scores here as those that are primarily synth, sample, or sound design led, outside of the orchestral practice. More traditional instrumentation is, of course, welcome and is often used in conjunction with electronic elements under the hybrid moniker, but is less likely to be the predominant generator or carrier of musical meaning in the film. Samuel Chase defined this particular brand of amotivic and electronic scoring as film minimalism, an amalgam of sorts between post-minimalist styles with a bias towards secondary musical parameters, i.e. the timbral or the textural. Any fan of Nine Inch Nails will easily understand the aesthetic influences that project has on the cinematic music of Reznor and Ross, its two permanent members. There are overt production similarities around the types of distortion used, like bit crushers and tube and tape saturation. Their synths in much of their scoring, both hardware and software based, wouldn't be out of place on the more ambient ends of a Nine Inch Nails Ghosts release, for example. Even samples and beat construction can overlap. Though, in fairness, that last example was originally a Nine Inch Nails track that was repurposed for The Social Network, but there are certainly sample and rhythmic similarities throughout. But they also use some notable instrumentational elements that are unique to each of their scores and relevant only to that individual picture. For Dragon Tattoo, they had a desired tonal direction and a clear approach on how to attain it compositionally. We wanted to create the sound of coldness, emotionally and also physically. We wanted to take lots of acoustic instruments and transplant them into a very inorganic setting and dress the set around them with electronics. The acoustic elements used to portray this coldness revolve mainly around tuned percussion, mostly metallophones, very glass-like or metallic in their sonority, such as the bells and bars of the Indonesian gamelan ensemble. And the Glockenspiel and Celeste from the Western Orchestra. These are then all electronically manipulated, as we'd expect, through plenty of space-generating reverb and very unnatural pitch bends. But the iciness of these textures works on an almost instinctive level. Of course, there are culturally derived semiotic associations between wintertime coldness and church bells, for example. And the film is indeed set at winter and was released around Christmas time. But it feels intuitively deeper than this. We almost know the bars being struck would be cold to the touch, even more so in the freezing Swedish setting that we see on screen as we hear them. The environmental wide shots are also often scored by long, slow ambient drones and pedal notes, subtly pitch bent and blurred into the diegetic wind noise. And while as monophonic drones, they may be limited in their harmonic complexity, their gradual sound design-based modulation is effective in denoting the grand, unending expanses of rural Sweden. The characteristic distortion of these textures then gives us the idea that these otherwise serene, open plains are hiding some very dark secrets with very rough edges, namely Nazism, incest, and biblical murder. Nice. In fact, the manner in which the score orients itself around the emotions and viewpoint of the darkest themes and characters in the film is what led Chase to call this type of scoring misempathetic, where through its indifference, the music is often unable to empathize with the protagonist. He says, "In The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the music acts incongruently to the image track, not due to the protagonist's view of the world, but due to the world's view of the protagonist." So Lisbeth is a ward of the state and is considered insane.
I am insane.
Mikhail is a convicted libelist.
Written by a libelist.
Society has largely shunned them, so the score resigns society, or the audience in this case, to the horrors of the antagonist's whims through the music's expression of their POV, or at the very least through its indifference to the protagonist's POV.
Can't thank you enough for bringing her to me.
For instance, the cue "We Could Wait Forever" underscores the initial meeting with Björman in his office, and it precedes the first abuse scene. It begins empathetically with distorted drones simmering under the surface of the interaction. They're predominantly very bassy with very little treble information, and it's almost analogous to having our ears submerged, kind of drowning in Lisbeth's inner turmoil and growing rage in that moment. This starts to build the necessary tension, and because the music doesn't intrude on the frequency spectrum of the dialogue,
We'll have to assume the difference is going to drugs.
Taken care of myself since I was 10.
State has taken care of you. Miss Hollander, please, look at me. This is important. Since your behavior...
this rapid exchange of plot information has an acoustic space carved out for it. The continued sound design-based augmentation of an otherwise very simple drone can then keep the audience hooked on a single note. Then, as we return to the office for the abuse scene, the atmospherically compatible cue with the flies plays, though this time misempathetically through the modal illusion of the higher synth pad. The higher synth line oscillates between an E natural and an F, an incongruently Lydian sounding sharpened fourth and fifth. Lydian is often referred to as the brightest mode, projecting an almost saccharine wistfulness. So perversely, through this brightness, we have shifted into Björman's twisted euphoria as he carries out his abuse. This musical embodiment, and therefore emotional empathy with the motivations of Lisbeth's eventual rapist, is the very essence of the impact that many of Reznor and Ross's scores have through their almost cruel juxtapositions and POVs.
Along with my hoodie and my fuck you flip-flops, you pretentious douchebag!
Security's here. You'll be leaving now.
It's interesting that Lydian's sharpened fourth degree is being used here in film scoring, as it often is. But despite Reznor's classical piano training, we're likely reaching this device via the 90s rock and metal scene of Reznor's rise to prominence. Industrial rock and metal from this period onwards often uses the dissonance of the sharpened fourth degree, but with overdrive and distortion to subvert that brightness into something with attitude and aggression. It's interesting that the color that this generates can be attained and recontextualized through any number of writing customs, and not just the orchestral theory and language of the native film scoring practice. Importantly though, an acoustic instrument that's seemingly omnipresent in all of Reznor and Ross's scores, despite their electronic orientation, is the piano. It's used melodically, both empathetically, and misempathetically in cues like "Please Take Your Hand Away." But notice in this latter example, it has a haunting, detuned digital quality, which paired with the very grim search terms we see on Lisbeth's computer screen, kind of makes a mockery of the fourth to major third movement that it's playing. This could be an example of what Andy Hill refers to as a familiar unfamiliar. In this case, a familiar instrument, the piano, with an intangible eeriness through its less common electronic manipulation. It's another great example of a sonic representation of that juxtaposition between a very wholesome veneer harboring very dark secrets underneath. One of the most intriguing uses of the piano, though, is its more percussive iteration in the prepared piano, one which has had physical objects placed across its strings, soundboard, or anywhere within its body. These objects, like bolts, pegs, scrap metal, or really anything that the composer wants, are placed as such to mute the strings, causing atypical resonances and changing its attack and decay characteristics. Just a quick side note on this, attack and decay refer to how quickly a note reaches its peak once it's hit and how quickly it dies away when held. ADSR, or attack, decay, sustain, release, probably more easily understood in the context of the synthesizer oscillator. So here's a very quick 101. A slower attack means a more gradual peak of the initial note strike. A faster attack reaches that peak more quickly. A faster decay means the note is quicker to retreat and settle at its sustain level once pressed. Sustain is the note's volume as the key is held, and a longer release lets the note resonate longer after the key has been released. A shorter one dies away to silence more quickly. The prepared piano's similarity with a drum hit through its fast decay and emphasis on its attack or its transience can make it a very useful, percussive, non-melodic device. Rhythmic elements like this are often used to denote the temporal, in its most obvious analogy to a ticking clock, for instance in cue The Seconds Drag. Dragon Tattoo's dense plot necessitated a 5-act structure. This could easily become very slow in its pacing, if not aided by these punctuations of percussive textures to help drive some momentum, with the prepared piano adding a very distinctive layer to this musical rhythmic pacing, like in the cue Pinned and Mounted. The prepared piano has featured in scores and modern concert music throughout the 20th and 21st centuries for its unconventional aural quality. But Reznor and Ross are perhaps in a minority in utilizing its texture within a score that is this electronically derived and this heavily quantized. The cue's transitions between scenes also helps to aid the pacing very effectively, with synth textures bleeding from one unrelated scene to another, tying the experience of the two protagonists together before they meet. Importantly, these textures also meander in and out of diegesis, as the audience is led to second-guess the source of the audio that they're hearing, whether it comes from the score or from Foley or sound effects. As Atticus Ross explains,
we were playing around with the idea of sound design as music as well. And there's like a floor cleaner that was just in it. And we latched on to that. We asked, could we get that file? And then we tuned it and see if we got the wow, wow, wow.
Another example of this being the infamous tattooing scene. The diegetic sound, the buzzing of the tattoo machine blends in perfectly to the buzzing, distorted synth lines in the score, which then reverberate out, persisting in the audience's inner ear as they contemplate the spectacle of what they've just witnessed, as we then transition back into Mikhail's continued narrative. These interesting interdiegetic devices function on many levels. They blend together or transition between seemingly disparate character arcs. They enhance the audience's memory of the moments they score through the heightened sensory immersion they provide. But perhaps most importantly, their environmental derivation within the film's sound world is another iteration of the score's functional misempathy. The film gravitates around various injustices: the state's treatment of Lisbeth, Werner Strom's treatment of Mikhail, even the natural environment's apathy to human suffering. As Chase states, by bridging the gap between sound design and music, Reznor and Ross were able to mirror through their non-diegetic score the apathy of natural phenomena like snow, wind, and rain, as well as the apathy of many of the human characters. This apathy, or misempathy, has become emblematic of most of their work with David Fincher for his recurrent, nihilistic, darkly absurdist themes. The scores skew far more towards cynicism rather than sincerity, so in this context, gravitating the score around the digital portrays a necessary lack of human warmth for a narrative that is completely devoid of it. Even the very subtle allusion to a solo female voice in the film's opening and closing cues, signifying both Lisbeth and Harriet's lonely plight, has a sampled, not performed quality. The most arguably human and importantly feminine element of their instrumentation, still being contorted by electronics, portrays again the idea of humanity's tainting of nature and beauty through the systems and whims of its sickest men. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross are part of a growing trend in the scoring industry, which more and more often seeks outside talent from the popular music space, in particular alternative and electronic scenes and genres, along with the likes of Jeff Barrow of Portishead, Mika Levy of Mikachu and the Shapes, and Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead. Seemingly more and more popular artists are lending their outsider's ear to the scoring practice, injecting new compositional material into the possibilities of what film music can be. Similarly to Reznor and Ross, these artists tend to gravitate around Chase's idea of film minimalism, leaning more towards electronically derived, or at least electronically manipulated, textural content.
When we write music, it's not coming from a love of melody and a joy of intricate chord progressions or technical wizardry. It's just, I want you to authentically feel this way.
Barrow attributes the success of this movement to the directors far more than the composers. Through the artist's pre-existing persona from previous work and the director's prior affinity with their music, they're able to become tastemakers of their own material in a sense. And directors without a fluency in musical language can maintain some semblance of musical control within their film, or indeed confidently relinquish that control altogether by choosing to collaborate with an idiosyncratic voice through which they have prior experience, trust, and faith being affected by. This begs the question as to whether or not a film score's reception by audiences or critics may be biased in some way due to prior taste-based allegiances or fandom, or the rejection of them. There's the possibility that musicians might be employed as film composers for some sense of sonic newness without having an adequate dramatic voice. But perhaps this is no more a loss than a dramatically trained composer with nothing new to say. These unique voices creating truly original music for film may be integral to the longevity of film music as a medium. With the startlingly rapid onslaught of machine learning and generative AI in the music space, it's possible that within a few years, or let's face it, months, the level of mimicry these models will be capable of generating, having been trained on 100+ years of orchestral film music, may be frightening. But it will be just that, though, an elaborate form of mimicry, and if used by a director, likely just musical set dressing for some cliched aesthetic of what they believe film music should sound like based on historical convention. Until generative AI is capable of producing truly conceptual material, I envisage that these idiosyncratic voices with pre-existing fandoms and allegiances will maintain the importance of human connection to a human source in film music. Equally, generative AI is, for now, only capable of synthesizing a facsimile of a recording. And a recording in itself was only ever supposed to be a facsimile of the true origin of the artistic expression, the live performance. Perhaps the intangible, alchemical power of human beings coming together, collaborating in a shared physical space, regardless of virtuosity accuracy or imperfection will always have more artistic merit than the granular regurgitation of a machine learning algorithm, but time will tell. The success of Reznor and Ross's work, particularly with David Fincher, is largely attained through a combination of their innate understanding of the technology they're utilizing and how they apply it emotionally. Through, as Chase called, misempathy, they use incongruently pleasant textures and harmony with subtly unfamiliar augmentations to make absurd the very dark themes and narratives Fincher so vividly realizes. They blend acoustic and electronic elements in a post-minimal but distinct way, referencing but always expanding upon the incredible repertoire in the pop music space. They prove that composers can write entirely to concepts and ideas without the rigidity of composing to a locked picture edit. And the freedom and dexterity this provides to a director and an editor can be ever more effective in how they subsume their audience into that bespoke sound world. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is one of the purest exemplifications of these techniques and processes. Its coldness is perfectly executed for its characters and its setting, and is perhaps one of the greatest examples of an electronic or ambient film score's ability to unsettle rather than soothe. So a big thank you if you've made it this far. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications for when I drop future episodes. So in part 2, we'll be diving into my recreation of the cue What If We Could, looking at how Reznor and Ross used synths and acoustic instruments to create one of the more sentimental and empathetic cues in the score. So stick around for that, and I'll see you in part 2. Okay, so welcome to part 2, where we're going to go through my recreation of the cue What If We Could. I chose it mainly because not only is it one of the more conventionally emotionally impactful moments in the film, you know, it's a full circle moment. The cue is played earlier in the film where Elizabeth and Mikhail are kind of intimate for the first time in a way that she hadn't been with someone before on that level. And then in this final end scene that leads us into the end credits, the heartbreaking moment where she kind of lets Mikhail in and wants to establish something more with him, only for him to go back with Erica, his previous romantic interest. And she kind of rides off into the sunset or into midnight and is kind of pretty heartbroken. So pretty emotional. It's also a little bit more forgiving to recreate. It's centered around more acoustic instrumentation with some of those minor kind of embellishments electronically. If it was a completely synth-driven cue, it would be potentially harder to recreate some of the timbre of those textures, just because Reznor and Ross use a lot of outboard hardware-based synths, much more difficult to reproduce. So yeah, I initially recreated it to the studio recording, which was about 4.5 minutes, but then when dropping the picture back in for the sake of this session, realized that it had been cut down to picture. So I've just done a quick kind of edit down to the 2.5 minutes that it is in the film, and it does actually flow a little bit better. It was a bit too long and drawn out beforehand. So I'll give it a full playthrough, and then we'll go through a couple of bits and bobs around how I recreated it. So this is the cue What If We Could.
Swedish authorities warn. Wennerström spent the last days of his
Must be a very good friend.
So yeah, pretty tragic moment when you're kind of immersed in Elizabeth's character throughout the runtime of the film. Pretty big betrayal from Mikhail. So starting with the basics, just started with the tempo map, time signature being 3/4. So kind of sync that to picture. And then it was just a case of going through each individual element one by one, bringing it in when you hear it on the original. So the very first kind of texture we hear are these kind of tremolo dulcimer pad. These are all the dulcimers here. And with varying levels of reverb and delay, you get this kind of pad-like quality, but derived from an acoustic performed kind of timbre. And that just sets off the bed for the whole cue, really, and it continues in the return of section A and the return of section B as well. One of them has a tremolo plugin assigned, which is a spatial tremolo from left to right, and then another one has a tremolo which is just a mono tremolo just for volume, just to give that oscillating sense of space, and they're split up in octaves as well. There's a third later on, I think, playing a kind of seventh note underneath. It's a little bit more rhythmic to the end there. I think you've got a quaver note pulse. The natural kind of muted piano sound is this felt piano library. Worked kind of beautifully for this. I think they were really early on the trend of the felt piano before it was made really kind of prominent around 2013. Very simple little line. Very somber. Very hand covers Bruise from The Social Network. Slightly more optimistic sounding B section. Which in context with the scene just makes it all that more heartbreaking. There was also another pad element. It was using the tail of the piano sample and looping this so that it's a kind of infinite piano note, which for me at least gives a sense that time is being slowed in that moment a little bit. You've got the main piano motif happening over the top, but then it's immersed and subsumed by this bed of the piano tail that it's actually playing, and the infinite nature of that note kind of really draws out the moment in time, particularly as it's a Fincher movie, so it's very quick cuts, but it still allows you to pause in that moment a little bit. So here's what that sounds like in context. And here's what that sampler's doing. So regarding the icy metallophones that we hear, it's mainly around the Celeste and the Glockenspiel for conventional instrumentation as you'd hear them recorded. But there are some more plunky embellishments, as I've called them here, which were more bespoke textural creations effectively. So the Celeste, again, much like the piano line, intersects quite nicely with that. And then the Glockenspiel comes in towards the end there and interacts again quite nicely with it. Very wintry, very twee, and therefore very incongruent with the heartbreaking moment we've just witnessed. This kind of misempathetic, jolly, wintry joy just makes it all that more cruel for Lisbeth effectively. So these more bespoke, plunky textures we got here from layering up a number of things. So we have a gamelan sample, a straightforward sine synth, a more sharp sawtooth synth, and a marimba just for a woody warmth underneath. So a lot of the attitude of the moment of her realization, that boiling rage, comes from the distorted synth lines as it has throughout the film. So they were quite interesting to build. More bespoke. It was a combination of hardware and software-based synths. I only have one hardware-based synth. It's an Arturia Micro Brute 2, but it packs a punch, particularly with some plugins on top of it. So started off with a massive instance with the soft pad. I just solo all of the synths here. Very angelic, kind of sweet pad there over the B section, of the optimistic B section. And then we get this dirge. We also have a psaltery kind of note there for some sharpness on top, which is echoing the sharpness we're getting from this really, really aggressive guzheng sound. Traditional Chinese instrument, loads of friction in that bowing sound, loads of upper harmonics. Really psychotic sounding, even though it's under this optimistic B section. Harmonically, it should be very congruent with the nice jolly glockenspiel. Just the ferocity of those harmonics coming from that bowing, though, is really menacing. And particularly when you see Lisbeth and it joins there where she first sees them. Just solo the synths and the guzheng. Just completely livid, and that really helps reinforce that. So somewhat poetically, the last cue in the film kind of echoes the first cue in the film. There's a solo female voice, which is usually very hard to replicate because I am neither a vocalist nor female, but the production methodology of these composers coming from that electronic practice and way of doing things means that a lot of their even organic sounding textures are electronically or sample derived for the narrative importance that we discussed earlier. So that's very fortunate for me. Trying to reproduce this score, I am able to then use samples and have it sound very faithful to the original. Very simple and very poetically telling us that in many ways Lisbeth is right where she started. So again, thank you so much if you've made it this far. That was my recreation of Q, What If We Could. Really, really fun to reproduce, and this whole video essay has been amazing for me, learning about genuinely one of my absolute all-time favorite scores. It was one of the scores that opened my eyes in terms of what film scoring could be and just made it feel that much more attainable to myself and my musical background, being self-taught, being more on the production side of things rather than being classically trained or being on the performing side of things. So hugely inspiring, amazing to learn about. I really hope you enjoy what I've done so far and what I have yet to come. So if you don't want to miss that, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share to your heart's content, ding the bell to get notified, and I will catch you in the next one.